Merhaba, çok mutluyum. I don't know if you understood me, but I just said, hello, I'm very happy to be with you today. Thank you. Every Saturday morning, this group of young women in Egypt wakes up early, eats breakfast, brushes their teeth, and hops on a bus through slippery, muddy roads to a nearby slum. When they arrive, they met with children with disabilities and helped them make jewelry and candles that would later be sold in local markets. You'll see one of them here dressed as a clown, which, by the way, is a very sweaty experience. But she's very happy to be bringing joy to the children around her nonetheless. But would it come as a surprise to you that this group of young women volunteers are orphans? You see, most of us, whether we realize it or not, have a constructed image in our minds of what a helper looks like and what a helpee looks like. A helper is supposedly someone with enough resources and a capacity to think of and give to others, whereas a helpee is someone that is the others, the recipient of the aid, vulnerable, needy, and perhaps even poor. And yet, this group of young women volunteers was tired of being victimized and boxed in as just helpees and decided to take ownership and become helpers in their communities. The same year I was born, my dad started an orphanage in Egypt, and this young group, this young women group is actually, I consider, my sisters. But having grown up with this uncomfortable privilege of having my parents around while my sisters didn't, perhaps pushed me at an earlier age to really think critically about the difference between helpers and helpees and the dynamics between them. As humans, you and I tend to draw towards feelings of affirmation, of being needed and wanted, of having an impact on our society. And yet, in doing so, some of us have taken on the role of helper without allowing others the privilege of that role as well. So when this pattern progresses, when we constantly are the helpers without allowing others the role, what happens is we become trapped in a savior mentality. And this mentality is actually more rooted in self-fulfillment rather than in building others. As a result, we end up boxing in fully capable, excellent, and competent leaders into recipient roles rather than active participants towards positive change. So how do we break out of this mentality? And how do we widen the narrow narrative we have in our minds of what a helper looks like and what a helpee looks like? In my perspective, words are really powerful, and especially the words we use when we're referring to others. If you look with me on the screen, you'll find words that we use often to describe groups that perhaps have gone through some difficult times. Words like refugee, victim, trafficked, mentally ill, orphan, homeless. What using these words actually does is that it creates borders around a person and it boxes them in, perhaps undermining their identity and their character. If you'll notice, you'll find that these words actually focus more on what a person is lacking or what a person's stance is in society and actually magnifies that which makes them perhaps different. I mean, homeless. What does that word really tell you about a person other than the fact that they don't have a home? Think of the stigmas and the stereotypes that these words carry with them and how your use of these words can actually perpetuate these stereotypes. Instead, we should be using more words that actually reflect who the person is. And if we don't know, it's actually as simple as asking them, practicing active listening, and then referring to them as they wish to be referred to. And oftentimes, this could also mean words that are on the screen. So I'm not saying don't use those words, I'm just saying ask before you use the words. But in my view, one of the best ways to really break away from this savior mentality is an actual internal belief, acknowledgement, and admitting that these very groups of people are best placed and best fit to give to and to care for and to understand and to empathize and to lead the change we hope to see. And so I just want to say that when we actually have this belief within us that they are best placed, what happens is we begin to loosen that grip on the helper role and spur others towards it. And so my sisters growing up in this orphanage may have felt like they were boxed in labels of just being orphans, but they were able to transcend these borders into identities that nurture for one another and care for one another in remarkable ways that I've seen, and not just for one another, but for groups outside of themselves. For me, what boxed me in and what has always been a border for myself is this lingering question of what is home, as Ali mentioned. My story is one of the privileged immigrants whose parents actually had the choice to leave their country and travel somewhere else. I was born and raised in Cairo, Egypt, as part of the 2% Protestant Christian minority group. So I never really felt like I fit in Egypt. And when I was 12, my family and I emigrated to the United States, where we went to the suburbs of Georgia, where I found myself once again a minority, the only Egyptian in my school. And so I had fellow classmates asking me if I used to live in a pyramid in Egypt, if I rode camels to school, and if Egypt has computers. And these were serious questions. But I'd like to think that since then I have, maybe my English has improved and I have learned to adapt to the culture. But I realized that actually being a minority places an extra burden of responsibility to represent that which makes you different. So having been the only Egyptian in the school in the US, I felt like I had to represent what being an Egyptian meant, and yet I had never really felt fully Egyptian back in Egypt because I was part of a minority. And so, going back and forth between Egypt and the US, I asked myself, where do I really belong? What is really home? But it wasn't until January 2011 where I decided to go to Egypt to study a semester. And 10 days after I arrived, protests broke out in the streets, and a revolution was taking place before my eyes. Time somehow paused, and it didn't matter anymore where or what home was or is, because joining thousands of voices calling for their rights on the basis of their humanity allowed me to partake in something deeply universal. You see, we all became vulnerable, we all became helpers and helpees. It didn't matter our backgrounds, because we all needed each other to become something none of us could be on their own. We became the masses and brought about change. And since then, I've been comfortable to say that I am Egyptian, I am American, I am Christian. I can embrace and fully embody all so-called labels, but beyond these categories and into a deeper journey into my personal faith, I have found that I can nurture an identity of love, an identity that cares for and fights for justice, and somehow that feels far more enriching than identifying with names on my passports. And so, yes, I have multiple homes, and yes, I have multiple labels, but I have one passion, one identity that transcends and breaches these borders, and I can embrace it. However, I would like to share with you the stories of those who, unlike me and my family, had to flee their homes. In 2017, I joined the Na Takallam team, which Na Takallam is a startup that began by Aline, Sarah, and Reza Rahnema. And Na Takallam is the Arabic word for we speak. And so just like I started this presentation with some Turkish, I'd like for you to try saying Na Takallam. Okay, let's give it one more try. Na Takallam. Awesome, you're becoming fluent. So, Na Takallam means we speak in Arabic. At the core of Na Takallam's belief is the idea that being a refugee, is simply a status, not a reflection of one's identity, and not a reflection of one's skill set. And so we believe that those who have been forcibly displaced actually have skills and assets that can be leveraged towards generating an income for themselves. And one of these skills is their language, which they can use to teach online through Na Takallam or use for translation work also through Na Takallam. So to make it simple and to make you understand what exactly that means, here's an example. We have Kate. Kate is a student in the United States, and she's studying Arabic. On the other hand, we have Noor, an educated Syrian that had to flee Syria during the war and is currently in Lebanon without work authorization. Kate can pay for 1-hour practice Arabic sessions with Noor, and in the meantime, we are breaking away from this idea that refugees are helpees that need to receive aid, and actually here, Noor is the one that is doing the helping of Kate's Arabic advancement. In the meantime, she is receiving financial compensation, and she's gaining marketable skills, and perhaps even a restored sense of purpose. But those who have been forcibly displaced, yes, they face displacement, they face lack of work authorizations, stigmas and prejudices and unspeakable struggles, but perhaps they also go through questioning of their identities and what home is, and maybe questions that I myself also went through. And I would love to share with you 2 stories of one of our conversation partners, language tutors on Na Takallam. And I'll start with Ghaith. Ghaith is currently studying international relations at a university in Italy. But his journey to there has not been so easy. In 2013, Ghaith found himself forced to serve in the Syrian military against his belief. When he was in the Syrian military, his military unit was actually under siege for 2 months, and he found himself having to eat grass to survive. A bomb hit his unit, and till today, he still has shrapnel in his head that is noticeable as he goes through airport security. And so Ghaith decided he was going to escape the Syrian military. He paid smugglers to take a donkey through dangerous mountainous roads between Syria and Lebanon. But when he reached Lebanon, it didn't necessarily get easier because he had to leave behind his ID card with the Syrian military. And so for 3 years, he lived in hiding, in constant anxiety and fear of being caught, which he was a couple of times and was arrested. Meanwhile, his family also faced arrest where they were. Against all odds, Ghaith actually met with a humanitarian organization that helped him resettle to Italy. He's one of the lucky ones, the less than 1% of refugees that makes it out. Ghaith is one of our best conversation partners and translators, and I personally consider him a friend. He listens to me when I have stressful days, and he actually helped me with this TEDx talk. When I asked him what his goal is for the coming 5 years, this is what he said. My goal is to be a cultural mediator with refugees. I can understand refugees because I am a refugee. I understand their needs, thoughts, and ideas. I'd love to share with you the story of Hadia, who I Skyped at a time where the power was out for her where she was and the screen was dark. Hadia started her story by telling me that it's very, very sad, but then she said, but this made me stronger. Hadia and her husband had to escape Kamshli in Syria because of heavy sickness she was experiencing and a very dangerous road to get to a hospital. And so they ended up in Erbil, Iraq, where she was met with an ambulance right at the border, taken to 4 different hospitals to understand what was happening. In so doing, she had to leave her 2-week-old baby behind in Syria with her mother-in-law and didn't see her for another 4 months. Hadia and her husband Shadi are currently living in a camp in Erbil. Hadia is surviving leukemia as we speak. When I spoke with her, she mentioned that living in a tent with lack of electricity and water and unclean environment affects her health. She has to take an ambulance to the hospital every now and then, but she said this line over and over again, I decided not to give up. And so she started working with Handicap International in camp. She started teaching English at her camp because she had English literature as part of her undergrad studies. She started teaching Arabic through Na Takallam because she has something called resilience, right? I spoke with her husband, Shadi, as well, who explained to me that when she gets on these online calls with her students trying to teach them Arabic, she feels like she leaves behind her struggles and she travels with them. And she considers her students family, not just students. And in fact, some of them have visited her and her husband in camp. Unfortunately, a couple of months ago, Shadi and Hadia received news from UNHCR saying that their file does not meet standards for resettlement. However, they're still some of the most joyful people I've met. And so I'd like for us to think today, Ghaith and Hadia both showed incredible hope. They both show resilience and an internal kind of strength that maybe some of us here haven't tapped into. Though many would group them as part of the vulnerable refugee population that needs assistance and help, they've actually breached these borders and labels into identities of strength and resilience and hope. For me, struggling with the idea of what is home was the case until I learned to breach these borders and struggling questions into an identity of my own choice. And through grappling with this privilege of having my parents around while my sisters didn't, I've come to the conclusion that actually there is no fundamental difference between helpers and helpees. Rather, these are just constructs our minds have made to make better sense of the world. We like to think of things in black and white, and sometimes gray is hard to understand, but in fact, helpers and helpees, there is no difference between them because you see, these roles are meant to be interchangeable, not static, not solid. And so I challenge you that, yes, you may find in your life that someone's hardship weighs way more than yours, and so you can be actually a helper towards them, but I would challenge you to actually work towards allowing them to be the helpers and for you to become the helpee. Because they are more than capable of breaching their borders and creating identities that care and help and understand. And so, in conclusion, I would like to ask you, and I challenge you to ask yourself, what are these borders, categories, and labels, or maybe even uncomfortable questions that have boxed you into something? And how can you find an identity that breaches and transcends these borders? Thank you.